The black SUV tore through the guardrail and dropped straight into the frozen river before anyone could scream. I had maybe 4 seconds to decide. I threw my coat onto the snow, broke through the ice with my shoulder and went down into water cold enough to stop a heart, and I dragged an unconscious woman out of a sinking vehicle. When I crawled back onto the bank, my hands purple and my breath coming in torn pieces, a military convoy rolled to a stop above us. A Marine commander stepped down, looked at me for a long moment, straightened and saluted. Everything went silent. If you like stories where a buried past comes back into the light, subscribe to the channel now and stay with me until the very last minute. My name is Elias Brody, and until that afternoon I had spent 11 years being nobody in particular in Red Creek, Montana. I owned a garage on the north end of Willow Street with a hand-painted sign that had been repainted twice and never straightened, and I ran roadside recovery for anyone unlucky enough to slide into a ditch between the pass and the county line. I was 39 years old. I drove a pickup with a bad heater and a bedliner scarred by chains. My jeans held a permanent map of engine grease, and the screen on my phone had a crack running corner to corner that I had promised my daughter I would fix for 2 winters running. That was the whole of me as far as Red Creek knew, and I preferred it that way. The cold snap that week was the kind old men talk about for decades. The thermometer outside my bay door read 11 below at noon and kept sinking. I closed the garage early because Sadie had a science project due, and because I had promised her I would be home before dark, which is a promise I had broken enough times to know its weight. I was pulling the door down when the phone rang, and it was Marla Quinn out on the river highway with a dead battery and a granddaughter in the back seat. Some calls you take because it is work. That one I took because it was Marla. The river highway runs along the Blackwater, a 2-lane ribbon that hugs the water for 9 miles before climbing toward the base. In February, it is a corridor of black ice and blind curves where a guardrail is the only thing between a driver and moving water under a lid of ice. I had pulled 7 vehicles off that stretch in 3 winters, and I had told the county twice that the rail on the long curve was rusted through at the base. Nobody ever wrote me back. Marla's granddaughter watched me jump the battery and asked what was in the green box behind my seat. It was an old footlocker, olive drab, corners dented, a stenciled name mostly sanded off. Marla asked in the friendly way people ask in small towns where I had served. I said, a long time ago. That was the same answer I had given the parts salesman, the volunteer fire chief, and my own daughter. I closed the hood and got back into my truck with the heater rattling like a coin in a can. I want you to understand what was happening 30 miles away at the same hour because I learned all of it later, piece by piece, from people who had no reason left to lie. Claire Holloway, chief executive of North Star Aeronautics, was walking out of the assembly floor with a case of documents and a schedule that had no give in it. She was 42, precise, the kind of leader who read the technical petink instead of the summary, and she was scheduled at the Marine Corps installation past the ridge for the most important evaluation of her career. Her driver had the SUV warm at the curb. The main route was slowed by drifting and a jackknifed hauler near the interchange. Reginald Wainwright III, chairman of the board, called her personally and told her to take the river road. He was 58, third-generation money, a man who had never once in his life been the person who got wet. Claire mentioned that the SUV had thrown a steering system fault twice that month and that maintenance had flagged it. Wainwright told her engineering had cleared it, that the notice was closed, that she was chasing ghosts on the one afternoon. North Star could not afford a delay. What he did not tell her was that the company had been cutting maintenance and quality control spending for 6 straight quarters, and that a late arrival would invite exactly the kind of questions he had spent a year making sure nobody asked. I came onto the river road behind that SUV about 10 minutes later. I noticed it because the brake lights were pulsing in a rhythm that had nothing to do with the road, quick taps where there was no reason to tap, and because the vehicle was drifting a hand's width left of its lane and correcting too hard each time. I have watched vehicles for a living long enough to know the difference between a nervous driver and a machine arguing with the person holding the wheel. I dropped back and got both hands on my own wheel. Then, right before the long curve where the pavement leans toward the water, I saw the front left wheel of that SUV snap hard to the outside, all on its own. The SUV did not slide the way ice makes a vehicle slide. Ice is a soft betrayal, a long lazy arc where the back end floats out and the driver has a second to feel it happen. This was violent and mechanical, a decision made by a machine. The vehicle crossed the center line and hit the rusted guardrail with the sound of a dropped filing cabinet. Metal folded and let go, and the SUV went over the edge and dropped, nose first, into the black water. The ice took it like a sheet of glass under a boot, and a crack ran outward across the whole white surface in a shape I still see when I close my eyes. I stopped my truck across the road with the flashers going and was moving before I finished thinking. A man in a parka got to the broken rail and stopped there, and I do not blame him because from the top of that bank the ice looked like it was still deciding whether to keep failing. I called it in and gave the mile marker twice, told them steering failure, submerged vehicle, at least 2 occupants, and then I put the phone in the truck because a phone is dead weight in that water. I pulled the recovery line out of the bed, the yellow one with the loop I had spliced myself, and I ran one end around a rail post that still had bite in the ground and the other around my own chest under my arms. I knew the arithmetic. Water that cold gives a person about a minute of useful breath control and about 10 minutes of useful hands. I stripped my coat, my flannel, and my boots, because wet layers are anchors and I wanted my fingers to be the last thing that quit. I took the small punch tool from my door pocket, the spring-loaded one every recovery driver carries, and I put it in my teeth. Then I went over the bank and I did not run onto the ice. I went down flat and crawled, spreading my weight across the surface the way I was taught in a place I had spent a decade refusing to name. The ice hummed under my ribs. I heard it work, that low tearing sound, and I kept my elbows wide and kept moving toward the hole where the vehicle had gone in. The back of the SUV was still visible, tilted, the roof rack breaking the surface, and the cabin was filling fast because a submerged vehicle does not sink like a stone. It sinks like a lung emptying. The driver came up through the rear door as I reached the edge. He was young and he was gasping and he had a bad cut over one eye, and I got a hand into his collar and pushed him toward the ice shelf and pointed at the shore, and he understood enough to crawl. He shouted that she was still inside. I already knew. I filled my chest 3 times, quick and deep to load the blood, and I went under. Cold water is not cold at first. It is a hand around your throat, an instruction to inhale that you have to physically refuse. My chest locked and my vision narrowed to a gray tunnel with a bright ragged hole above me, and I pulled myself down along the body of the vehicle. Claire Holloway was in the back seat, the seat frame folded in against her hip, her belt drawn tight across her chest and locked hard from the impact. I got the punch against the glass and it broke inward in a cloud of small cubes that moved past my face like a school of fish. Then I reached for the belt release and my fingers would not close. They had already gone. I went up. I came out of that hole with a sound I am not proud of, and I hung on the ice edge for maybe 8 seconds, hammering my hands against my own forearms to force blood back into them. Somebody on the bank was screaming at me to wait for the trucks. There was no waiting. Whatever air was trapped in that cabin was almost gone. I loaded my chest again and went back down, and this time I did not try the buckle. I used the blade edge on the tool and cut the belt across the lap and then across the shoulder, and I got both arms under hers and dragged her out through the window frame, and the seat gave up its grip on her hip with a jolt that nearly took the tool out of my hand. Pulling a limp adult through water at that temperature is not heroic. It is slow and clumsy, and it takes everything. I found the light and kicked toward it and got her head into the air, and the man in the parka had come partway down the bank and taken up the slack on my line, and he hauled while I pushed her up onto the shelf. I got her out first. That was never in question. Then I tried to climb out after her, and my arms simply did not answer, and it took 2 men and the rope to drag me across the ice on my stomach like a landed fish. On the bank, I did not lie down. I rolled her, cleared her mouth, and put my ear to her lips, and there was nothing. So I started compressions with hands I could not feel and counted out loud because counting was the only thing keeping me conscious. On the 4th cycle, she coughed, and river water came up, and she breathed. I remember somebody wrapping a wool blanket around me. I remember the exact moment I heard engines coming down from the ridge, heavy diesel, a lot of them, in a spacing no civilian convoy ever keeps. They were Marines. 4 vehicles headed to North Star for the evaluation, and they came off the road in under a minute. A colonel stepped down from the 2nd truck, gray at the temples, 51 years old, moving the way senior officers move when they have already read the scene. He crossed to where I knelt in the snow, half naked, shaking. My hand still on a stranger's sternum, he stopped. His face changed in a way I can only describe as a door opening onto a room he had not entered in years. He said it very quietly. I lifted my head. 11 years is a long time, but a name spoken in a certain tone will find you through any amount of it, and my spine answered before my mind did. Everett Shaw had been a lieutenant with frost in his eyebrows and a radio he could not raise anybody on, a young officer I had pulled off a mountain in a winter exercise people still talk about in low voices. He was a colonel now. He walked the last 6 feet without hurrying, and he stopped in front of a soaking wet mechanic in a wool blanket, and he came to attention, and he saluted. The Marines behind him went absolutely still. Nobody had ordered it. There is a kind of silence that spreads through people who understand exactly what they are looking at, and it moved across that riverbank like weather. I did not want it. I have spent a third of my life arranging things so that this exact moment would never happen to me, and I felt it land on my shoulders like a coat I had thrown away on purpose, but my arm came up anyway, without permission, the way a hand goes to a wound. I returned the salute with 3 fingers I could not bend, and then I put my hand back on the blanket and I looked at the ice instead of at him. Shaw did not make a speech. He said my name once more in a normal voice, then turned into a commander and started giving orders. He had a corpsman on Claire in under a minute and a truck back to the shoulder to break the wind. He pulled off his own field coat and put it over my shoulders, heavier than anything I had worn in a decade, and told the corpsman that the man on the ground had been in the water twice. Then he crouched beside me and asked how long I had been under, which is the only question that mattered, and I told him the truth, which was that I had lost count. Claire came back far enough to be aware of the world about 10 minutes later, while they were getting her into warming packs on the tailgate. She told me afterward that the first clear picture she kept from that day was not the water and not the ice. It was a Marine colonel calling the wet, shaking, grease-stained man who had just cut her out of her own vehicle by the title major. She said it rearranged her understanding of the last hour so completely that she stopped trying to speak and simply watched. She had been rescued by a local record driver. That was the story she had assembled. And it was, apparently, wrong in some way she could not yet measure. North Star arrived before the second ambulance. One of the plant staff had recognized Claire's vehicle from the road and made a call, and inside of 30 minutes there were 3 company cars at the shoulder, carrying lawyers, private security, and a communications director in a very good coat. Reginald Wainwright III stepped out of the lead car and walked to the guardrail like a man inspecting a property line. He did not go to the tailgate where his chief executive lay under silver blankets with her lips gone gray. He went to the edge and looked down at the water where the roof rack of the SUV was still showing, and he asked how deep it was and whether the vehicle could be recovered tonight, and whether Claire's document case had come out with her. A young attorney from his group came over with a tablet and a pleasant voice and asked whether I had recorded any part of the incident, whether I had removed anything from the vehicle, and whether I had told anyone what I observed before it left the roadway. I was on a truck bumper with a corpsman taking my pulse, and a man in a $500 coat was building a record. I told him I pulled a woman out of a river and asked him to move. Then Wainwright himself came over. He thanked me in 11 words, which I counted later out of pure spite, and then he told me that the cause of a roadway accident is a technical matter for qualified investigators, and that speculation from a local garage mechanic could create confusion and unnecessary exposure. He said the word mechanic the way another man might flick ash off a sleeve. He said the company would of course see that I was compensated for my trouble. Compensated. For my trouble. Shaw was 6 feet away, and Shaw heard all of it. He turned around slowly. He asked Wainwright whether he was aware of who he was speaking to. Wainwright said he was speaking to a very brave local resident, and Shaw said in the flat, unhurried voice of a man who does not need to raise it that the very brave local resident had once been responsible for equipment and lives worth more than every vehicle, contract, and consultant North Star had parked along that guardrail combined. He said that when this man made an observation about a vehicle, it might be worth writing down instead of managing. Wainwright's mouth closed. For a moment, the chairman of a $2 billion company had absolutely nothing to say, and I stopped. I said, "Colonel." Just that. Shaw looked at me and understood, and he let it go because whatever he wanted to tell those people about me was mine to give away and not his. I had not spent 11 years keeping that box closed so it could be opened as a weapon in a roadside argument. The paramedics finally got me onto a gurney, and my hands had started to burn, which is the good sign and the worst pain, and I let them load me. But before they closed the doors, I found the county investigator, a tired woman with a clipboard and a notebook full of frozen ink. I told her to write down one line and to write down that I said it before anybody had touched the vehicle. I said, "That truck didn't slide because of ice. They kept me at the county hospital 4 hours, rewarming me slowly, watching my heart rhythm the way you watch a fire in dry country." My core had dropped further than I wanted to admit, and my fingertips looked like wax for 2 days. Around 9 that night, they let me go home in the colonel's field coat because my own clothes were still frozen in the bed of my truck, and a young corporal drove me because I was in no condition to hold a wheel. Sadie was waiting on the porch in her coat with the hood up, 12 years old, arms folded exactly the way her mother used to fold them. She looked at the military vehicle, and then at the coat with the eagle, globe, and anchor over my heart, and she did not ask if I was all right because she could see that I was. She asked why the Marines drove me home. I told her there had been an accident on the river road, that a convoy had been passing, and that they had helped. Every word of that was true, and every word of it was a door being closed gently in a child's face. She took it the way she takes most things, and made me soup from a can and sat on the arm of the chair, and after a while she said the coat smelled like snow. I hung it by the door, and I did not sleep much. It is a strange thing to spend a decade making yourself ordinary, and then have one afternoon undo the paperwork. Shaw came to the garage the next morning at 7 with 2 coffees and no escort. He sat on an upturned bucket next to the lift, a colonel in a service jacket in a shop that smells like gear oil. And neither of us performed anything. He asked about my daughter by name, which meant he had asked someone. And then, because he had earned it, we talked about the thing we had never talked about. 12 years earlier, I had been a major with a company of Marines in a cold weather exercise in high country, a scripted route and fixed timelines written by people looking at a map instead of the sky. On the second night, the weather turned in 40 minutes, a wind shift that dropped visibility to nothing and drove the temperature past anything the plan allowed for. 2 of my elements were above the tree line and out of position. Radio traffic was breaking apart against the terrain, and the plan called for us to hold and continue at first light. I read the sky and read the map, and I made a decision. I abandoned the exercise route, moved my headquarters element up along a drainage that was not in the plan, and built a rewarming line and a hand-over-hand rope route down through the worst of it. We brought back 19 Marines who were, by any honest reading, out of time. Everett Shaw was one of them. He was a lieutenant with 2 frostbitten fingers and a compass he had stopped trusting, and he told me that morning in my garage that he still could not describe the sound of my voice coming up that drainage. People in that community started saying my name a certain way afterward. I hated it then, and I hate it now, because we did not bring everybody back. A 20-year-old Lance Corporal named Danny Hoyt died on that mountain, and no number of letters, medals, or salutes has ever moved that number from 1 to 0. What happened after is the part nobody guesses. There was no scandal. I was not pushed out, I did not break, there was no secret that made me disappear. My career was, if anything, moving faster than I wanted. Then my wife, Nora, got sick in the spring and was gone by the following winter, and Sadie was 5 years old and asking why the house was quiet. I looked at the next set of orders, and I looked at my daughter, and I decided that the Marine Corps needed another field-grade officer, less than that child needed a father who was physically present. I put in my papers. I bought a garage in a town where nobody knew me. That is the entire mystery of Elias Brody. A man made an ordinary choice and then spent 11 years being embarrassed that anyone had ever thought him extraordinary. Shaw listened to all of it without interrupting, and then set his coffee down and asked me about the vehicle. Not the rescue, the vehicle. I told him exactly what I had seen: brake modulation with no input reason, a lane drift with overcorrection, and then a front wheel that broke the outside as a discrete event hard ahead of the curve at a speed where ice does not do that. I told him what 11 years under other people's cars had taught me, which is that a steering system failing under load has a signature, and that signature is a snap and not a slide. I told him I would testify to it in front of anybody, and that I would also say plainly that I could be wrong until somebody pulled that vehicle out and read the data. Then he told me something I had no business knowing yet. North Star Aeronautics was in final evaluation for a contract to supply flight control subsystems for a Marine Corps program, hardware that would sit between a pilot's hands and an aircraft's control surfaces. His unit was one of the evaluating bodies. And he said the sentence that turned an accident into a story. If a company is willing to leave a documented steering fault open on the vehicle carrying its own chief executive, he wanted to know what else it had decided was acceptable. I told him that was not my problem. I had a shop to open and a kid to pick up at 3:15. He stood, brushed the shop dust off his trousers, and looked at the green footlocker sitting under my workbench where I had moved it the night before without quite admitting to myself that I had moved it. "We inspect North Star tomorrow," he said. "I want you in that room." I said no. I said it twice and I meant it both times. I had spent a decade staying out of rooms where men are measured by the title in front of their name, and I had no interest in walking into a defense contractor's headquarters to be introduced as a curiosity, the local record driver who used to be somebody. Shaw did not push. He wrote a number on the back of a card, left it on my bench, and drove away, and I went back to a transmission that had been waiting 3 days and told myself the matter was closed. It stayed closed for about 26 hours. Then a car I did not recognize pulled into my lot on Thursday afternoon and Claire Holloway got out of it, alone, driving herself with a bruise across her cheekbone and her arm in a sling and the careful walk of someone whose ribs are unhappy. She should have been in a bed. She stood in the doorway of my bay and said thank you, and she meant it in a way the 11 words on the riverbank had not. We sat on 2 stools with the space heater running. She told me she remembered almost nothing of the water, which is normal, and which I told her was a mercy. She remembered leaving the plant. She remembered the wheel doing something wrong, then nothing until the tailgate, the silver blanket, and a colonel calling the man who had just pulled her out of the Blackwater by a rank. She said she had spent 2 nights on a hospital ceiling assembling a question, and the question was not who I used to be. The question was what I had seen, so I told her. I walked her through it the way I would walk a customer through a brake inspection, without drama, because drama is how people get talked out of true things. Snap, not slide. Front left, outboard, discreet, ahead of the curve, at a speed the road could hold. And then I said the part that mattered most, which is that a failure like that almost never arrives without warning. Systems complain before they quit. I asked her whether that vehicle had thrown any faults. She went very still. She told me she had received a maintenance notification about the steering system, that she had asked about it, and that she had been told by the chairman's office that the issue had been examined and resolved, and that the flag was closed. She had accepted that. She said the word accepted like a woman reading her own signature on a document she had not read. Then she asked me a question that I think cost her something. She asked whether a resolved flag with no corresponding repair record would look like anything in particular to a man who fixes vehicles for a living. I told her it would look like somebody closing a window instead of fixing the leak. She asked me to come to North Star, not as a hero and not as a witness for anybody's side, but as an independent technical observer with no relationship to the company. I told her I would come for 1 day, that I would say only what I could support, and that I would leave at 2:30 because my daughter finishes school at 3:15. She agreed to all 3 without blinking, and I have respected her ever since for not trying to negotiate the 3rd one. North Star headquarters is glass and pale stone, with a full-scale rotor assembly hung in the lobby like a sculpture. I walked in Friday morning in clean work boots, a canvas jacket, and the only collared shirt I own without a shop name on it. And I have never been looked at by so many people trying so hard to appear not to be looking. Wainwright made sure the contrast landed. He greeted the evaluation team and then he gestured at me and explained to the room that Miss Holloway had graciously invited a local garage mechanic who had assisted at the scene, and that while everyone was of course grateful, the board wished to note that mechanical speculation from a roadside recovery operator was not evidence and should not be recorded as such. I did not argue. Arguing in a room like that is how you become the story instead of the facts. I sat down, put my hands flat on the table, and waited. Then the doors opened and Colonel Everett Shaw came in with 2 officers and a civilian data specialist, and every person at that table stood up out of habit. Shaw walked the length of the room, and he did not salute, because a second salute would have been theater and both of us knew it. He put out his hand and shook mine first before the chairman, before the chief executive, before anybody, and he said good morning by name. Wainwright watched that handshake the way a man watches a crack appear in a wall he owns. The recovery team had pulled the SUV out of the Blackwater on Wednesday night, and the data specialist had spent 30 hours with its modules. He put the results on the screen without remark, because none was needed. The electronic power steering system had logged a fault 3 separate times in the 14 days before the accident. Once on a highway run, once at low speed in the plant lot, once the morning of. Each event matched a torque sensor irregularity consistent with an intermittent failure that ends, eventually, in a full loss of assist and an uncommanded input. All 3 faults had been closed in the fleet maintenance system with the status resolved. There were no work orders, no parts drawn from inventory, no technician sign-off, no bench test. Nothing behind the word except the word. The specialist said it plainly. The faults had not been repaired, they had been administratively cleared. Claire did not look at the screen. She looked down the table at Reginald Wainwright, and then she asked, in a voice that carried to every corner of that glass room, who in the company held authorization to close a safety-flagged fleet fault without an accompanying repair record. The fleet manager answered before his own attorney could stop him. Closure. Authority at that level sat with exactly one office in the building, and it was the office of the chairman of the board. I want to be careful here because the easy version of this story is that a rich man tried to kill his chief executive, and that is not what happened. Reginald Wainwright did not want Claire Holloway in that river. What he wanted was for the quarter to look a certain way. He had been told about the fault, and he had, through an assistant, through a process, through the comfortable machinery of a man who never touches anything directly, decided it could wait until after the contract award, because opening a maintenance action meant logging a cost, and logging a cost meant a line on a chart that a Marine Corps evaluation team would eventually read. That is the truth, and it is worse than malice, because malice is rare and this is everywhere. The SUV was the smallest possible piece of evidence. It was a company vehicle, one line item in a fleet, and it had still been enough to nearly drown the person at the top of the organization. Claire understood that inside of 10 seconds. She stopped the meeting and requested immediate access to the internal quality records for every program line, including the military subsystems. Wainwright objected on grounds of confidentiality, proprietary process, and board prerogative, and he objected in the calm voice of a man who has used those 3 words to close doors for 30 years. They gave me a stack of quality reports that afternoon because Claire asked, and because Shaw's presence made refusing awkward. I am not an auditor, but I have read a great deal of maintenance language, 2 very different lives, and there is a vocabulary that appears when an organization has quietly decided a known problem will be somebody else's problem. Provisionally acceptable. Monitor at next interval. No operational impact anticipated. Deferred pending resource availability. I had seen those exact constructions in logistics and readiness reporting years earlier, and I had learned that they are not descriptions of a system. They're descriptions of a culture. I said so, once briefly, and Wainwright told the room that a man who changes oil filters was now offering linguistic analysis of engineering documentation. Shaw did not answer him. Shaw simply informed Northstar that the Marine Corps was formally requesting all quality control documentation associated with the program subsystems, and that the evaluation would not proceed to the next phase until that documentation had been produced and reviewed. That is a sentence with hundreds of millions of dollars inside it, and everyone in the room heard the money move. Wainwright stopped defending after that and started attacking, which is what men like him always do the moment a wall stops working. Over the weekend, his outside counsel went looking for me. They pulled everything a person can pull about a former officer, and by Monday morning they had found exactly one thing, and they brought it into the conference room with the satisfaction of a cat delivering something to a doorstep. 12 years ago, following that winter exercise, Major Elias Brody had been the subject of a formal command investigation for failure to execute the assigned mission plan. Wainwright read that line aloud twice. He held up the cover page with the word investigation visible from across the room. He explained to the board members present, to Claire, to the evaluation team, that the individual whose roadside speculation had triggered this disruption was a former officer who had been investigated for disregarding orders, that his judgment had been formally questioned by his own service, and that Northstar was now allowing this man to influence a federal procurement process. He said he found it extraordinary. He asked Claire whether she had known. She had not known. I watched her face and I watched her not know, and I watched the doubt land, because doubt is reasonable and she is a reasonable woman. 2 days earlier she had been unconscious in a river, and now the man who pulled her out came with a document titled Investigation. Half the table looked away from me. That is what those papers are for. I did not defend myself. I have thought about why since, and the honest answer is that I have never once been able to talk about that mountain without hearing a name I do not have the right to use for my own credibility. So I said 4 words, and they were the only 4 I had. Read the last page. Shaw was already reaching into his case. He put the complete report, all 51 pages of it, face up on the table in front of the chairman, and he told him to read aloud from the findings if he wanted the room to have the full context. Wainwright did not read it, so Shaw did. The investigation had examined whether the deviation from the exercise plan was justified. It found that the original plan had become dangerous under the actual conditions, that continuing it would have resulted in the loss of the majority of 2 elements, and that the commanding officer's decision to reroute and establish an unplanned rewarming and extraction line was the direct cause of the survival of 19 Marines. The investigation did not recommend charges. It did not recommend correction. Its final paragraph recommended commendation. Nobody spoke. Wainwright was still holding the cover page in the air like a man who had walked into a room carrying a weapon and discovered it was a photograph. He set it down very slowly. The chairman of North Star Aeronautics had just told a Marine Corps colonel, at length, that a man had been investigated for saving a Marine Corps unit, and there was no version of that afternoon he was going to walk away from clean. Claire did not gloat, and she did not apologize in front of the room, which I appreciated. She went back to work. Her team pulled every fleet and facility fault closed as resolved in the previous 18 months and cross-referenced each against work orders and parts draws. She called me at home near midnight to read me the number. Out of 406 safety-flagged items closed without a repair record, dozens carried the same closure signature, the same authorization path, the same 3 faultless letters, the same nothing behind the word, as the steering system on the vehicle that put her in the Blackwater. After that night, the question in the building stopped being who I used to be and became what North Star had been hiding from itself. Claire built a quiet audit team with outside counsel and 2 independent engineers, and what they found in 9 days was not a forged document or a shredded file. It was an incentive structure. 4 years earlier, the board had approved a management compensation model in which division leaders lost a meaningful portion of their annual award if open technical defects in their area exceeded a threshold. Nobody had ever been instructed to hide a fault. Every manager in that company had simply been paid to have fewer of them on paper, and human beings are extraordinarily good at solving the problem they are actually paid to solve. So the defects got downgraded. Critical became major. Major became monitor at next interval, and the chart reaching the chairman's office every quarter was beautiful. Wainwright had designed a machine that produced the numbers he wanted and then declined to ask how. A young propulsion engineer handed the auditors an email he had sent 19 months earlier, warning that severity classifications on a control subsystem were being adjusted downward without engineering review. It had been received by the chairman's office. It had been opened. Nobody had ever answered it. Claire told me what kept her awake was not the near drowning. It was the arithmetic that if a wrecker driver had not been 9 seconds behind her that day, she would have been the first consequence large enough to make anyone look, and the whole structure would have come apart anyway with a funeral in the middle of it. Wainwright made one last move. He convened the governance committee and proposed suspending Claire for conduct destructive to stockholder value, and he genuinely believed she would trade silence for the chief executive's chair because that trade had always worked for him. She refused it in a single sentence. Then she went further than anyone expected and suspended every North Star deliverable connected to the military program pending a full independent requalification of the affected subsystems, a decision that cost the company somewhere north of $40 million and torched the delivery schedule she had spent 3 years defending. Wainwright told her she was destroying a legacy his family had spent 70 years building. Claire told him a company can rebuild a margin, and that nobody has ever rebuilt a person. And that was the moment, I think, when he understood that she was not negotiating. I was never the hero of that part. Everything after the riverbank was done by people who worked inside that building and who chose, finally, to say out loud what they already knew. The board was called into emergency session on a Tuesday to choose between Claire Holloway and Reginald Wainwright III. He walked in confident, and he had reason to be. His family held a substantial block of stock, 4 of the 11 members had served alongside him for more than 20 years, and one of them had been at his wedding. He spoke for 18 minutes and he was good. He described a chief executive traumatized by a near-fatal accident, making catastrophic decisions from a hospital bed, encouraged by an outsider with a history of disregarding established plans. He used the word steady 4 times. Claire spoke for 6 minutes and used no adjectives at all. She put the SUV fault log on the screen with its 3 closures and its 0 repairs. She put up the engineer's email with the received timestamp and the empty reply field. She put up the severity downgrade pattern across 211 items. She put up the compensation model with the defect threshold circled. She put up the independent audit's conclusion, which stated in the flattest language available that Northstar's quality reporting could not be relied upon as an accurate representation of technical risk. Then she sat down. Shaw was present as an observer and made one statement. The Marine Corps was suspending consideration of the Northstar bid until an independent safety evaluation was complete. He said explicitly that the suspension had not been requested by any private party and was not connected to the man who had rendered assistance on the river road. It was a response to documentary evidence that a supplier's defect reporting was unreliable. I was glad it was true, because a service does not exist to settle a mechanic's argument. The first board member to move was a retired airline operations executive who said she had approved that compensation model herself and had not understood what she was approving. After her, it went quickly. Reginald Wainwright was removed as chairman that afternoon pending the outcome of a responsibility review, and his stock did not save him, because stock buys votes and does not buy the moment. When 4 people who have known you for 20 years look at a slide and see what you traded. Northstar did not collapse. It lost the quarter, lost the schedule, lost $200 million in market value inside a week, and lost a program it had built a decade around. Claire stood in front of 1,100 employees and told them why. That is the real cost of fixing something, and she paid it standing up. Afterward, she found me in the parking structure and asked me something she had clearly been carrying. She wanted to know why I had never used it. A colonel had saluted me in front of witnesses. I could have asked for a consulting agreement, a settlement, a title, a number with commas in it, and Northstar would have paid it gladly in that first week just to have me inside the tent. I told her I already had a job, and that it was 3:05 and I had to pick up my I was almost to my truck when I heard Shaw's footsteps behind me. He was holding an envelope, soft at the corners, the kind of paper that has been carried in a case for a long time. Inside were copies of 19 letters from Marines who had come down off that mountain. They had been collected by a sergeant major and sent to a headquarters address after I had already put in my papers and moved to a town nobody had heard of, and they had sat in Shaw's case for 11 years. None of them were about medals. One was from a man who had opened a hardware store in Ohio. One was from a woman with a son starting kindergarten that fall. One was 3 lines long and said only that he had made it home and his father had gotten to meet his grandchildren. Danny Hoyt's mother had written too, and she did not blame me, and I sat in my truck a long time before I could read the rest. Shaw said one more thing before he left. He said the salute on the riverbank had not been for a rank I gave up in a filing cabinet 12 years ago. He said he had watched a man with nothing to gain crawl out onto breaking ice for a stranger twice, and that he had saluted the part of me that had never actually resigned. Claire rebuilt Northstar over the following year. She moved safety and quality reporting out from under anyone whose compensation touched revenue, put 2 independent engineers on the review board with authority no executive could override, and published defect data internally where every employee could see it. She offered me a full-time advisory position with a salary that would have paid off my building 4 times over. I turned down the title. I agreed to help run cold weather and failure analysis training for their field teams 3 times a year, because that I can do without becoming someone else. I wanted the garage. I wanted my evenings. I wanted to be a father before I was anything. Spring came late that year, the way it always does in Red Creek. I was under a customer's pickup on a Saturday when Sadie came out of the office holding the old photograph she had found in the green footlocker, the one of a younger man in dress blues who does not look like he knows anything yet. She turned it over in her hands and asked me whether Colonel Shaw had saluted me, because I used to be someone important. I came out from under the truck and wiped my hands and looked at that photograph for a while. Then I told her the truth, which is that a rank has never once made a person important. What makes a person important is what they do in the 10 seconds after somebody needs help, and whether they do it when there is no one around to write it down. I told her that the man in that picture and the man with grease on his hands were the same man, and that neither one was worth more than the other. Outside the bay door, the snow along Willow Street had gone soft and gray at the edges, and somewhere past the tree line the black water was running high and loud with meltwater. I went back to the truck on the lift. Nothing about my life changed. I still open at 7 and I still pick her up at 3:15. But that afternoon I did not put the photograph back in the box. I set it on the shelf above the workbench where I can see it, and I left it there. I never went looking for the old light. I just finally stopped running from the part of my past that was worth being proud of.